They don't have any. This is why I hate them, because they're morally corrupt, ambiguous, no morality having scumbags. Their entire foundation is there are no moral facts. So if that's the case, how can you do anything immoral if there's no moral facts? I want fascism because I said so. So the question is, how can you tell a person, how do you tell Destiny that it's immoral that he sucked 50 dicks? I've never seen a great reason why women should be able to vote. Because they can vote to send men to war that they themselves do not have to go fight. I want a new Hitler because I said so. It's like, what's stopping 10 men from getting married and adopting a kid? Nothing. Nothing's preventing that.
This argument sounds devastating at first. If you don't believe in God, you can't justify morality. And if you can't justify morality, you can't object to power, which leads to a very convenient conclusion. The people who think they have the truth should be in charge. Now, on the surface, that feels like a checkmate, because it flips the whole debate. It's no longer about whether a system works, it's about whether you can even say it's wrong. But there's a problem. Actually, there are several. And they all start the moment you ask a very simple question. Where does morality actually come from? And how does it survive contact with reality? Because this argument only works if you quietly assume two things. First, that morality needs a perfect foundation to function. And second, that one system uniquely provides it. If either of those fails, the whole structure goes with it. And they both fail almost immediately. Before we get into it, let's be precise about what's being claimed. This is not an argument about whether Christianity is true. It's an argument about power. The claim is, morality needs an objective foundation. Secular systems don't have one. Christianity does. Therefore, Christian ethics should govern society. Now that's the strongest version of it. And parts of it are absolutely right. Law does reflect morality. Neutrality is largely a myth. And yes, the state ultimately runs on force. Those are real observations. But they don't get you where this argument wants to go. Because the real question isn't, does morality have a foundation? It's what actually makes moral systems work when you put them inside real societies, with real incentives, real disagreement, and real constraints. That's where this argument starts to come apart.
They don't have any. This is why I hate them, because they're morally corrupt, ambiguous, no morality having scumbags. And that's what they want to do. They want to take a fact and then argue their vibes about the fact. But when you get to their foundations, what is their foundation? They don't have any.
Hold on. That's a very big claim. Not that secular moral systems are wrong, not that they produce bad outcomes, not that they're inconsistent. The claim is that they don't exist at all. Now that's awfully convenient, because if your opponent has no foundation, you never actually have to engage with it. But before we declare victory, shouldn't we at least examine one? If somebody asked what Christianity's foundation was, we wouldn't accept it doesn't have one as an answer. We'd expect an argument. Yet here, we're being told that every secular moral framework developed over centuries can be dismissed in a single sentence.
Their entire foundation is there are no moral facts. So if that's the case, how can you do anything immoral if there's no moral facts? How? You can't. You can't ever do anything immoral if you don't believe there's no moral facts.
He's no longer saying secular morality is bad. He's saying it can't exist. The logic is simple. If there are no objective moral facts, then nothing can ever be truly right or wrong. But notice what he's done. He's moved from a philosophical question to a practical conclusion without showing the connection. Even if I grant him, for the sake of argument, that secular morality struggles to justify itself at the deepest philosophical level, it doesn't follow that morality disappears. It doesn't follow that courts stop distinguishing murder from self-defense. It doesn't follow that societies stop enforcing rules. And it certainly doesn't follow that Christian morality wins by default. At most, he's identified a problem. He hasn't established his solution. That's an important distinction, because exposing a weakness in one position is not the same thing as proving your own.
They believe that we are immoral, so they must have some kind of morality. It's just
Stance-dependent morality.
Let's start with the core claim. The idea that without God, morality is arbitrary. That if you remove a divine foundation, you're left with nothing but preferences. Now, to be fair, this is not a stupid argument. It's pointing at a real philosophical problem. If morality is just human opinion, why should anyone obey it? Why does wrong actually mean anything? That's a serious question. But here's the move the argument makes. It quietly shifts from can you justify morality to does morality work at all? And those are not the same question, because whatever you think about ultimate justification, we can observe something very simple. Secular societies function. They enforce laws, they sustain cooperation, they punish theft, fraud, violence. People don't just wander around saying, well, morality is subjective, so I'll do whatever I want. That's not what happens. So the question becomes, how? If there's no shared divine foundation, why doesn't everything fall apart? It's mechanical. Morality, in practice, is not a philosophical proof. It's a system of behavior stabilized by incentives and constraints. For example, modern commercial societies depend on anonymous cooperation between millions of strangers, something no shared theology can realistically coordinate. A supplier in Japan ships components to Germany, financed through banks in London, enforced by contracts in Singapore. And none of these actors need agreement on ultimate morality. What sustains the system is enforcement of contracts, reputational consequences, and repeat interaction. If you violate those norms, you pay for it. If you follow them, you benefit. That's enough to sustain a system. You don't need agreement on eternity to enforce a contract on Tuesday. And this is where the argument quietly collapses, because it assumes if morality isn't perfectly grounded, it doesn't exist. But what we actually see is the opposite. Morality exists because it works. Not because everyone agrees on why it's true. The explanation ends precisely where the real mechanism begins.
The point of government is to make people do shit they don't want to do.
Completely agree. But the promise of the leftists, the promise of the progressive, the reason they demand that we have a secular government and we can't move towards Christian ethics or Christian nationalism is because secularists are going to do what's fair. And what's fair is you can do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anybody else. We're not going to force you to do anything. The evil Christian nationalists will. But here you just laid out a case for how it is that they're compelling me against my will to do various things.
At this point, the argument usually shifts. Fine, secular systems function, but only because they're borrowing from Christianity. The claim is, all these values, human dignity, equality, charity, rights, they didn't come from nowhere. They came from Christian ethics. And without that foundation, they eventually collapse. Now this is more serious, because this one is partly true. Christianity absolutely shaped a huge part of Western moral thinking. The idea that all people have equal worth, the expansion of moral concern beyond tribe or nation, the emphasis on caring for the weak. These didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were developed, spread, and reinforced through Christian institutions. No honest analysis denies that. But here's the problem. The argument takes that truth and makes a leap it can't justify. It assumes because an idea came from somewhere, it depends on that source to survive. And that doesn't follow at all. Because ideas don't behave like that. They don't stay attached to their origin like a power cable. They become embedded in systems. Once principles like fairness, reciprocity, and equal treatment are built into laws, institutions, and expectations, they start reinforcing themselves. Not because people agree on theology, but because the system rewards those behaviors, punishes violations, and makes cooperation more valuable than conflict. So yes, Christianity influenced these norms, but modern systems don't borrow them in the way this argument implies. They operate on them because they're functional. An idea can have a source without needing a life support machine, and once you see that, the claim loses its force because it's no longer about origin. It's about whether the system still works, and it does.
If there are no moral facts, because I said so, that's why. And that's the failure of left-wing and progressive anti-realists. If there are no moral facts, and you ask me why it is that I should enforce my worldview, because I fucking want to. And there's no way for you to ever object against that.
Mm-hmm.
I want fascism because I said so.
Mm-hmm.
I want a new Hitler because I said so, right? Let's say that. If you can't point at that and say that that's wrong, right? There's some objective appeal to a standard for why that's really immoral and you shouldn't do it, then what happens is erosion. And the reason that erosion happens is because everything becomes permitted. The religious say that that God gave us moral facts, and these are the moral ways in which you have to live your life. And so they're willing to enforce that. They're willing to enforce those moral facts because for them not to do that is immoral, right? Allowing my society to run around and do immoral things, obviously I want to curtail that. The other side thinks that that's totalitarian though, right? That's the worldview divide. So the question is, how can you tell a person, how do you tell Destiny that it's immoral that he sucked 50 dicks? How do you do that? If it's the case that that's not a moral fact. How? Well, you can't.
At this point, the argument is leaning heavily on a very specific idea, that morality belongs to Christianity, that it originates there, and without it, it doesn't hold. So let's test that. Because for this claim to work, Christian morality has to be something like a source code, original, self-contained, not dependent on anything else. But the moment you look at history, that picture disappears. Christian ethics didn't emerge in isolation. It's built on earlier systems. So what you actually get is not a single origin, it's a fusion. Ideas being selected, adapted, and combined over time. And that matters because it tells you something fundamental. Morality doesn't appear fully formed. It evolves. It absorbs what works. It discards what doesn't. And it gets shaped by the constraints societies face, which means the claim that morality comes from Christianity is already incomplete, because Christianity itself is standing on layers that came before it. This isn't a source, it's a synthesis. And once you see that, the ownership claim starts to fall apart, because no one system gets to say, we are the origin, therefore we are the authority. That link doesn't hold.
So, an example of this, I was told with gay marriage that it's no big deal. It's just like heterosexual people getting married. Well, okay, well, what's the argument against 3 men or 4 men getting married and then adopting a child? There really isn't one. You can't really be consistent and be against that.
Hold on. This is a classic reductio ad absurdum. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that technique. If I can show that your logic leads somewhere absurd, that's a perfectly valid criticism. The problem is that you actually have to demonstrate the connection. You don't get to simply point at something further down the road and declare victory. If somebody says free speech should have no limits whatsoever, then asking, so slander should be legal, is a legitimate challenge because slander is speech. The connection is obvious. But that's not what's happening here. The argument is gay marriage was accepted, therefore 3 men marrying might be accepted, therefore 10 men marrying might be accepted, therefore society is eroding. But notice something. Not one of those steps has actually been demonstrated. They're simply asserted. Listen to the key line again.
It's like, what's stopping 10 men from getting married and adopting a kid? Nothing. Nothing's preventing that.
Really? Nothing? Not public opinion, not legislatures, not courts, not cultural norms, not political opposition, not the exact same process that decides every other social question. Apparently, once one change occurs, society loses all ability to draw another boundary. But if we applied that reasoning consistently, it would prove almost anything. Women get the vote. What's stopping 6-year-olds getting the vote? Nothing. Therefore, democracy is collapsing. Interracial marriage becomes legal. What's stopping people marrying their cousins? Nothing. Therefore, society is collapsing. We legalize divorce. What's stopping people having 10 wives? Nothing. Therefore, society is collapsing. You can generate an endless number of slippery slopes like this. The hard part isn't imagining the next step. The hard part is proving the next step actually follows. And this is strange for another reason. Christian morality evolved. It absorbed ideas from Judaism, Roman law, Stoicism, and countless social developments over centuries. But now, we're suddenly asked to believe that the moment one social norm changes, every future boundary must collapse as well. Why? Why can't secular societies do exactly what societies have always done? Evaluate new proposals one at a time, accept some, reject others, modify others, draw new boundaries. That's not inconsistency. That's how moral systems actually evolve. Every society in history has done this, including Christian societies. The deeper problem is that this argument treats morality like a domino chain. Remove one tile, and apparently the whole structure must fall. But that's not how moral systems behave in practice. They don't operate through logical necessity. They operate through institutions, incentives, traditions, public opinion, legislation, courts, and cultural norms. In other words, through exactly the same evolutionary process that has shaped every moral system we've ever had.
So what's your answer to all those questions? Your answer is God said this is right, this is wrong, therefore that's how we know what's right and wrong, basically. Was that
Well, I would say something more important, which is that Christian ethics, even if you don't believe it, let's say, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe in any of that nonsense. What you should believe, though, is in outcomes. And the outcomes of Christian ethics, even on secular society, are the best outcomes.
Now we get to the most important claim, the one everything else is leaning on. This is the conclusion the whole argument is trying to justify. For this to work, three things have to be true. First, you need to define what best outcomes actually means. Second, you need a way to measure it. And third, you need to show that those outcomes are caused by Christian governance. There's no definition. Is it economic prosperity, social stability, personal freedom, or family formation? These don't all move together. They trade off. Increase control, you might get stability and lose freedom. Increase freedom, you might get innovation and lose cohesion. So immediately you're dealing with allocation problems.
What you should believe, though, is in outcomes, and the outcomes of Christian ethics, even on secular society, are the best outcomes.
Who decides which outcome matters more? Which group benefits? Which group adjusts? That question never gets answered. Then there's measurement. Where is the comparison? Which societies? Which time periods? What variables are being isolated? Again, nothing. And most importantly, there's no mechanism, no explanation for how belief translates into better decision-making inside institutions. How does Christian ethics turn into better policy, better incentives, or better outcomes? That link is never built. It's assumed. And that's where the argument gives itself away. Because instead of showing the process, it jumps straight to the result. This isn't an argument. It's a conclusion wearing a lab coat.
So if that's the case I would make for why I think Christians should be in charge of basically everything, is that the outcomes are still going to be best for even the people who aren't Christians. Now, maybe they don't like that, but so what? I don't like their view either. And I think Christians should be in charge, and they have no objection because they have no moral facts. So who cares? It comes down to, like you said, at the very beginning of the conversation, we'll circle it all the way back, comes down to who has the force. Well, it's going to be the ideology in charge who has the force. So is it going to be mine, or is it going to be yours? Is it going to be the commies? Who's it going to be?
Now here's where the argument turns on itself, because at one point there's an admission that is actually correct. That's true. States use force. They enforce laws. They compel behavior. They restrict options. There's no serious political system without that. So far, no disagreement. But now watch what happens next. If all politics involves force, then every system uses coercion. So if coercion is the problem, you don't solve it by swapping who's in charge. You haven't removed force, you've just reassigned it. And that's exactly what this argument does. It criticizes secular systems for imposing values, enforcing behavior, using state power, and then turns around and says, yes, but our values should be enforced instead. That's not a solution. That's symmetry. Same mechanism, different justification. And this is where economics becomes unavoidable, because power doesn't behave differently just because you believe you're right. The incentives don't change. Concentrate authority, and you get weaker accountability, fewer constraints, and slower correction of mistakes.
And that's what I think the state of actual world affairs and politics is now. It's like a race to the top. Who gets there first? I don't know if it's depressing. Like it's almost like may the best man win, right? May the best ideology win.
It doesn't matter what the justification is. Moral certainty doesn't fix that. If anything, it makes it worse. Because now disagreement isn't just wrong, it's immoral. And once you reach that point, you don't get better outcomes. You get less feedback, more rigidity, and higher risk of failure. So the argument ends up in a position it can't escape. It identifies coercion as the defining feature of politics, and then justifies expanding it. If force is the problem, changing the owner doesn't solve it. And at that point, the structure starts to give way. Because what was presented as a moral argument is now just a preference for who holds power.
What I mean is, it sort of sounds like, well, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding this genuinely, you'd like people to get married and to vote as a household, which I imagine would kind of mean that the head of the family, which is the husband, would tend to decide that. And if a woman isn't married, presumably she wouldn't be getting a vote partly for that reason.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, what's wrong with that system? Sounds great.
Now we move from theory to something much more revealing. Because eventually these arguments have to produce rules, and rules can be tested.
Yeah, what's wrong with that system? Sounds great.
The reasoning here is simple. Women can vote for wars that they don't have to fight. So the implication is political rights should be tied to civic burden.
Now, the arguments against women voting are pretty simple, and the idea is landholdership and force, right? Can women utilize force in order to maintain land? The answer is no. Generally, that takes men.
At first glance, that sounds like a principle. Rights follow responsibility. Fine. Let's test it. If voting power depends on war participation, then the rule is clear. Equalize the burden implies equalize the rights. So either women are included in that burden, or the rule applies consistently across everyone who doesn't bear it. But that's not what happens.
I've never seen a great reason why women should be able to vote, because they can vote to send men to war that they themselves do not have to go fight.
The moment that implication appears, the argument shifts. It retreats into practicality, combat differences, physical capability, and real-world constraints. In other words, the principle disappears as soon as it becomes inconvenient. And that tells you something critical. This isn't a rule being applied. It's a conclusion being protected. The logic moves just enough to keep the outcome intact. And once that happens, the argument loses its structure. Because now the standard isn't what follows from the principle, it's what preserves the conclusion. And that's not reasoning, that's selection. The rule holds right up until it applies to him.
And so now it's a race for power. It's made the best ideology win. And from my view, if it's not Christians who win it, then it's going to be somebody else who wins it, and Christians going to be ruled by whoever that is, or whatever ideology that is.
Now we take the final step. Because up to this point, everything has been theoretical. Foundations, origins, justifications. But none of that matters if the system doesn't work in practice. So let's take the argument seriously. Assume we implement it. Christian ethics guiding law, cultural dominance enforced, moral legislation expanded, and immigration shaped by religious criteria. What has to happen for this to succeed? You need compliance from a diverse population, stable cooperation, competent governance, sustained productivity, and long-term legitimacy. That's the test. Now we run it through reality, starting with incentives. Power flows to those who align with the system, not necessarily those who are most capable, but those who are most loyal. So over time, competence is filtered out in favor of ideological alignment. Bad decisions don't disappear. They persist longer because fewer people are able to challenge them. People don't stop disagreeing. They just stop doing it openly. So dissent doesn't go away. It moves. Underground, informal, harder to measure, harder to correct. You don't get unity. You get hidden conflict. It's often high-skill individuals, minorities, people with mobility. So the system loses human capital, quietly but steadily. Positions become ideological. Positions are no longer allocated purely on performance. They're filtered through ideology, which means resources are misallocated, not because people are malicious, but because the system rewards the wrong signal. Attempts to enforce ideological unity often produce resistance, not abstract resistance, real, organized, persistent opposition. Because once belief is tied to power, disagreement stops being tolerated and starts being punished. And that changes behavior. People don't suddenly agree. They adapt, they comply publicly, they dissent privately, they organize quietly, which means the system doesn't eliminate disagreement. It distorts where it shows up. And that distortion makes the system less stable, not more. Belief isn't directly controllable. Behavior is. So what gets enforced is behavior, while belief goes underground. And that creates a gap between what people say and what they think. A system that runs on that gap doesn't become stronger. It becomes harder to read, harder to correct, and more vulnerable to sudden breakdown, because the feedback disappears before the pressure does. At this point, there are only two ways out. First, it would be done properly. But that assumes away incentives. Systems don't run on intentions, they run on behavior under constraints. Second, Christian rulers would be moral. But moral certainty doesn't reduce risk, it increases it. Because now mistakes aren't just mistakes, they're defended. And dissent isn't just disagreement, it's opposition to something framed as truth, which makes correction harder, not easier. This works only if people behave against their incentives. And systems don't run on hope. This argument claims that morality belongs to one system, that without it, nothing holds together, and that with it, you can justify taking control. But once you actually follow it through, from origin to function to implementation, that claim doesn't survive, because morality didn't arrive fully formed. From a single source, it was built layer by layer across cultures under constraints. And when systems concentrate moral certainty with political power, historical evidence shows a consistent pattern: reduced feedback, increased rigidity, and greater risk of systemic failure. Not because intentions are bad, but because incentives no longer punish mistakes effectively. And when you take this idea, moral certainty plus political power, and actually test it in that world, it doesn't produce stability. It removes the very constraints that make morality work in the first place. That's not a solution. That's not even a theory. That's a hostile takeover with hymns. And once you see it clearly, there's nothing left to defend. If you want more breakdowns like this, where confident arguments get tested against how systems actually work, subscribe. Because the pattern is always the same: strong claims, weak mechanisms, and conclusions that collapse under pressure.